Okay, I'm gonna be honest. This video kind of got away from me. I had this idea that I would focus on the history of Prussian blue, or more specifically, Prussian blue's introduction to Japan. It's a wonderful moment in art history. And then I started doing research, and I got really excited, and I learned a lot of cool stuff about Japanese art and about the history of the color blue. So I tried to put it all in one video, and it turns out that an entire survey of the history of blue and a deep dive into Japanese woodblock printing is too much for one video. So I edited down. This is just going to be a whistle-stop tour of the history of blue pigments. And there will be a second video that is about ukiyo-e art and the impact that Prussian blue had on Japan. I'm including this little explanation because otherwise it'll be really weird why I keep mentioning Japan throughout the video, and also the original intro doesn't make sense anymore. So anyways, welcome to Great Art Theory. I'm Dan, and this is the history of the color blue. I'm going to list 6-ish, depending on how you count them, blue pigments that changed art. And since I have a numbered list, now would be a great time to come up with a clickbait title for the video. So how about 6 blues that art historians don't want you to know about? Emoji, 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 exclamation point. Number 1, indigo. Indigo is an organic, plant-derived pigment. It gets its name from the Latin word for India, because that's where Romans would import this dye from. But the first examples of indigo predate the founding of Rome by over 3,000 years. Archaeologists found this 6,000-year-old scrap of fabric near Huayca Prieta, an ancient Andean ceremonial mound in northern Peru. This predates the next oldest example of indigo, which was found in Egypt, by well over 1,000 years, and it proves that indigo was independently invented in multiple parts of the world during the Neolithic period. Indigo made its way to Japan around 600 CE, and it would remain the most prominent blue pigment for well over 1,000 years. This is a section of the Amitabha Sutra, made in Japan in the mid-13th century. Just look at that rich, vibrant blue. Sutras like this one were commissioned by wealthy patrons as an offering to temples, and I think it's a really good place to start because the color blue being associated with both wealth and religion is going to be a bit of a theme moving forward. Indigo is beautiful, and it is still used all over the world today. It remains the dye of choice for shibori, a Japanese tie-dye technique, as well as a lot of luxury denim goods, although most denim now uses synthetic dyes. But there are some problems with indigo. One, indigo is not light fast. Light fastness is the ability of a material to retain its color when exposed to light. When exposed to light for long periods of time, indigo will turn brown. The Amitabha Sutra only looks this good because it was kept in a sutra repository and rarely taken out. It's also not chemically stable. Indigo turns gray or brown in the presence of a strong acid or base. Because of how labor-intensive indigo is to make, for most of its history, it was associated with wealth. Speaking of being associated with wealth and power, number 2, Egyptian blue. This is William. William is not the oldest example of Egyptian blue, but he is the cutest. So we're gonna start here. This hippopotamus gets his name from a 1931 Punch magazine article. The author, Hilary Mason Riley, describes William like this. In color, he is a delicate blend of greens, blues, and yellows. He has the air of one waiting patiently for the day of judgment. His shape is irregular and dumpy, and Marjorie and I can never decide which is the most adorable end of him, but it is impossible to look at him for long without a feeling of awe and a realization of the vastness of eternity. William was crafted around 1900 BCE from Egyptian faience. It's a type of ceramic, although it's a bit of a misnomer because faience properly refers to tin-glazed pottery, and this ain't that. But also, Egyptian blue was probably invented in Mesopotamia. So yeah, Egyptian blue isn't Egyptian, and Egyptian faience isn't faience. And it only gets worse from there because ancient Egyptians and Greeks sometimes referred to both the color and the ceramic as lapis lazuli, which is just a completely different thing. And researchers often prefer the term glazed frit, or they use this Egyptian word, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce. I spent so much time at the library trying to get all these terms straight that my brain started to dribble out my nose. Luckily, Egyptians have a solution for that. Egyptian blue is a copper-based greenish blue pigment. Developed over 5,000 years ago, this is the oldest known synthetic pigment. While it's not quite as blue as indigo, it has incredible luster and staying power. I mean, look at this. At almost 4,000 years old, William is looking good for his age. And he's in good company, because Egyptians went absolutely bonkers for this color. Egyptian blue was prized by wealthy Egyptians because it mimicked rare, precious, and semi-precious stones like sapphire, lapis lazuli, and azurite. But it wasn't just a money flex. The color blue was believed to have magical properties. Blue contained the power of life, so tombs were filled with small figurines like William. William was meant to come alive in the afterlife to protect the deceased. Hippopotamuses are horrifying creatures, and Egyptians would have good reason to fear them. But they're also associated with the goddess Taweret, who is a protector of mothers and children. Let's compare indigo with Egyptian blue. So unlike indigo, Egyptian blue is both light safe and chemically stable. It'll keep its color for centuries. And that's important to Egyptian burial rites. After all, they went through a lot of trouble to preserve their dead, so putting them in a tomb with a short-lived pigment like indigo wouldn't cut it. Production and use of Egyptian blue spread throughout the Mediterranean and as far as northern China, but after the fall of dynastic Egypt, its production died out. By the beginning of the Middle Ages, knowledge of how to produce this color was lost, and as far as we know, the pigment never reached Japan. No one really knows why ancient people stopped making Egyptian blue, though there are some speculations. One very popular explanation is that people outside of Egypt just didn't like blue all that much. Greek, Roman, and Chinese artists rarely used blue. In Blue, the History of a Color, Michel Pastoureau says, "Wearing blue was looked down upon. No shade was considered acceptable. Having blue eyes was considered a deformity, which indicated loose morals and barbarism." Google Arts and Culture tells us that Greeks and Romans didn't even have a word for the color blue. YouTube's own ASAP Science corroborates this and goes on to say that Greeks might have been unable to perceive the color blue. After all, why else would Homer compare the color of the sea to the color of wine? I could go on for a while, because if you search for the history of the color blue, you will find a lot of sources making claims like this, from IFL Science to Business Insider, and it's absolute nonsense. First of all over the ancient world, people continued to use blue. Ancient people dyed their clothes blue with indigo or woad or dayflower. Most Greek and Roman paintings are lost, but we know that they painted all of their sculptures, and by analyzing trace minerals on the surface, researchers can reconstruct how these sculptures would have been painted, and these reconstructions often show blue. Like this sculpture of Augustus. If blue is a shameful color, you wouldn't put it on your emperor. The claim that Romans associated blue with barbarism is because Britons may have decorated their bodies with blue paint. This ignores that the Romans would have also associated the color with Egypt, whom they greatly admired. Oh, and how do we know that the Britons painted their bodies blue? It's because of Roman accounts. How would the Romans have written down these descriptions if they had no word for the color blue? It's because they did have a word for the color blue. All of these languages had lots of ways to describe blue. For example, Latin had vitro, which referred to blue-colored glass, or caeruleus, which basically means the color of the sky. And in case you haven't touched grass in a while, the sky is blue. Some languages, like Japanese, either lack or lacked a word that maps exactly to the modern English word blue, but you don't need a dedicated word. English doesn't have a word that perfectly translates the Italian word azzurro. Instead, we say light blue or sky blue, and that works just fine. Sure, Homer calls the sea wine dark in a poem. Allow him some artistic license. The descriptive power of a language is not limited by the number of discrete words it has for individual concepts, and people's perceptive powers are not limited by the words they know. And don't even get me started on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is almost invariably used to stack rank languages by their level of advancement, which ends up just being a proxy for how similar they are to modern English. Okay, I need to calm down. Sorry. I just, I have a podcast I listen to when I'm getting agitated. It's like a guided meditation. Just give me 1 second.
Clear your mind. Inhale slowly through your nose, feeling your lungs expand with air, and exhale gently through your mouth. Release any tension you may be holding. Slowly close your eyes. Imagine yourself standing in front of a vast, serene body of water. The surface is calm, reflecting the clear sky above. The sky is blue, a soft, soothing shade that fills your vision. The blue around you starts to deepen, becoming richer and more vibrant. It's as if you're looking into the depths of the ocean. This is indigo. Continue to breathe deeply, in through your nose, and breathe out through your mouth. The waves of the ocean become the warp and weft of a great tapestry. This is the fabric of the human race, woven by many hands over many centuries. Think upon your ancestors, wandering under vast blue skies, sailing over the deep blue oceans, and wearing the richest blue garments. Take comfort in knowing they sure as shit had a word for this color.
Okay, I feel better. Ancient color systems and linguistics are fascinating on their own and worth a whole video. Luckily, Metatron already made this video. Check out the link in the description. There's a lot more to say about Egyptian blue and why it disappeared, but that could also be its own video, so moving on. Number 3, azurite. Azurite is a naturally occurring mineral found in many parts of the world near copper deposits. The oldest example I could find of azurite being used as a paint pigment is in the Dunhuang murals. These murals were painted on the walls of caves dug by Chinese Buddhists between 400 and 800 CE. As you can see, the colors range from blue-gray to coppery green, and that green is caused by malachite impurities in the pigment. I couldn't find exactly when azurite entered Japan, but my guess is sometime around the 1300s. It was the dominant blue for high-end painting in Japan, like this 17th century painting, The Battle of Yashima. All of that rich blue water is painted with azurite. This painting depicts a scene from the Genpei War. In this battle, the Minamoto clan, identified by their white banners, attacks the rival Taira clan. The Minamoto win the battle and the war, becoming Japan's first military rulers. We'll get back to azurite in a minute, but first, azurite.
I'm really happy for you. I'm gonna let you finish. But
Ultramarine.
One of the best
blues.
all time.
Number 4, ultramarine. Ultramarine is made from lapis lazuli, a rare semi-precious stone. I'm going to be referring to the pigment as ultramarine and the stone that it is derived from as lapis lazuli, but this is by no means a universally followed convention. Lapis lazuli gets its name from the Latin word lapis, meaning stone, and lazuli from the Persian lazaward, meaning lapis lazuli. Ultramarine was used extremely rarely, and when it was more often a thin glaze on top of azurite or indigo to deepen the color, like in the San Giabe altarpiece painted by Bellini in 1487. Mary's bright blue robes are made with ultramarine, but the underpainting is azurite. Even that thin glaze on top makes a heck of a difference though, because ultramarine is just mind-blowingly blue. The pigment was almost never used on its own because it was crazy expensive. Azurite is more expensive than gold, and ultramarine is more expensive than azurite by a lot. In Renaissance Europe, having ultramarine on your wall was the ultimate signal of wealth and power. For much of its history, ultramarine was used almost exclusively by the Catholic Church, especially for depictions of the Virgin Mary. Eventually, secular patrons would also request ultramarine for lavish demonstrations of wealth. That aura of exclusivity even extends to modern art. In the 20th century, Yves Klein helped create an ultramarine-based pigment which he named International Klein Blue, or IKB. He attempted to patent this color, but no such patent was ever granted. Nonetheless, rumors spread and continues to this day that only Klein could use this very specific blue. It adds this layer of exclusivity to his work, which is almost entirely done with that signature blue. Some of his work has sold for just disgusting sums of money. Artist and painter Stuart Semple makes an incredibly Kleinish blue to lampoon the exclusivity of IKB, but really most synthetic ultramarine paint today can achieve similar results. Eve's work builds on very specifically European fixation with ultramarine, because although this pigment was the height of luxury north of the Mediterranean, and lapis lazuli, the stone, was prized throughout the world, the pigment was rarely used in other major artistic centers like China and India, and it never made its way to Japan. The pigment certainly traveled down the Silk Road, so if Japanese artists had wanted this pigment, they would have had access, but Japan stuck to indigo and azurite. I found a few sources that mention Japan's lack of ultramarine, but none of them attempt to explain why. So I'm gonna make an educated guess. I think it has a lot to do with how paints were made. Paint has three primary components: the pigment, the vehicle, and the binder. So far, we've only been talking about the pigment. That's the stuff that gives paint its color. Indigo, Egyptian blue, azurite, and ultramarine are all pigments. To make a paint liquid, pigments are suspended in a vehicle. For example, in watercolor paint, the vehicle is water. The binder is a glue that makes the pigment stick to a surface. If you just mix powdered pigment with water, then when the water evaporates, you'd be left with just that powder smeared on a surface and it would rub right off. Most watercolor paints today, the binder is gum arabic. Azurite is light fast, but it is not chemically stable. Azurite can turn gray when mixed with egg yolk, which was the most common paint binder in medieval Europe. During the Renaissance, oil painting became more popular, and azurite has a tendency to turn green when mixed with oil. And very few pigments survive the highly alkaline plaster used in fresco. So Europeans would have had a hell of a time keeping azurite looking fresh. In Japan, on the other hand, the binder for water-based inks was rice starch, which is fairly non-reactive. And animal skin glue was also frequently used, and that is acidic, but I couldn't find any sources that explored whether or not that acidity has an effect on azurite. So if there's any chemists, please comment below. For Europeans, the fascination with ultramarine wasn't just because it was bluer. That extra cost was worth it because their painting methods made azurite less reliable. Japanese artists wouldn't have run into these same problems, so that extra expense wouldn't have been worth it. Okay, ultramarine was number 4 out of 6 pigments we're gonna talk about, so we're in the home stretch. There's one more pigment that was light fast and chemically stable and available in Japan prior to the 1800s, and that was number 5, cobalt. This one will be quick. Cobalt is most famous for its use in ceramic. In the 7th century, Chinese artists started painting pottery with cobalt under the glaze, resulting in brilliant blue images. The technique was exported to Japan around 1600. Cobalt gets its name from these little guys. Kobold is the German word for goblin. Miners referred to ores rich in cobalt as goblin ore or kobold ore, because it looked like known metals but gave off poisonous gases when smelted. So it was thought that goblins were going in and stealing all the good metals and replacing it with deadly kobold ore. I thought this story was cute, so I decided to make a lino-cut print of a cobalt kobold breathing deadly gas. To make a lino-cut print, I put my design onto linoleum and carve away everywhere that I don't want the ink to print. I'm basically making a big stamp. Once the stamp has been made, I can ink the print, but I realize I have no cobalt blue ink. And when I look online, I realize cobalt block printing ink isn't sold anywhere. And now that I think about it, Japanese artists, despite making cobalt blue ceramics, never used the pigment for woodblock prints. I reached out to the good people at Gamblin who make the ink that I use, and I asked them, why isn't cobalt used as a printmaking ink? They said cobalt is too opaque and dense in particle size for process-based printmaking techniques that require transparency. Not to mention the fact that cobalt is pretty expensive. So there you go. Cobalt is light fast, chemically stable, available in Japan, but very limited in its use case. I went ahead and printed my little cobalt kobold. I like the way he turned out, but since I couldn't use cobalt, this kobold was printed using number 6, Prussian blue. Unlike other pigments discussed, we know exactly when and how Prussian blue was discovered. It starts with an alchemist named Johann Conrad Dippel, who was born at Castle Frankenstein. Some people speculate that Dippel may have been the inspiration for Mary Shelley's Dr. Frankenstein, because he believed that souls could be transferred from one corpse to another and experimented on dead animals. Rumors abounded that he was in league with dark forces, largely driven by his controversial views on theology. In pursuit of the elixir of life, Dippel created an animal oil called Dippel's oil. At one point, he offered to buy Castle Frankenstein in exchange for his elixir, but the offer was rejected. I guess they thought it wouldn't work. Dippel set up a laboratory in Berlin and rented out space to a pigment maker named Johann Jacob Diesbach. Or Johann Jacob? In 1706, Diesbach was making a red pigment called Florentine Lake. He made this by boiling cochineal, I have a really hard time saying this word, boiling cochineal, a red insect, before adding ferrous sulfite and precipitating the mixture with alkali or potash. He ran out of alkali and asked to borrow some from Dippel. The potash Dippel gave him was contaminated with his elixir of life bone oil. To Diesbach's surprise, instead of a deep red, a brilliant blue appeared. What he had discovered was ferrocyanide. Keep in mind, up until this point, the only permanent blue pigments were either lost to the ages or more expensive than gold. Diesbach had just discovered an alternative to azurite and ultramarine, which was made using discarded potash and dead insects. Can you imagine? That would be like trying to make soap and accidentally discovering the cure for male pattern baldness. Finally, there was a blue pigment that was light fast, chemically stable, and cheap to produce. Needless to say, Diesbach saw dollar signs, or thaler signs, and by 1708 the pigment was being sold across Europe. The biggest buyer was the textile dyeing industry. Notably, the Prussian army used this color for all of their uniforms, and that's how it got its name, Prussian blue. Prussian blue is the color used by Thomas Gainsborough in his best-known work, The Blue Boy, painted in 1770. It was also the color of Picasso's blue period in the early 20th century. It's even the color of Big Ben's clock face, constructed in 1856. With all of these iconic examples of Prussian blue in Europe, still nothing compares to the impact that this color had when it reached the shores of Japan in the early 1800s. If you want to learn more about that, hit subscribe. As I said in the intro, the next video will be a deep dive into ukiyo-e art, and I will also talk about what might be the most iconic work of art ever made. Eagle-eyed observers may have noticed subtle hints throughout the video as to what work of art I'm talking about. If you spotted it, leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.